Right now, there is a signal in your life that refuses to stay quiet. It shows up in small ways first, then it grows louder, then it starts repeating itself until it becomes impossible to ignore. You've already noticed it, not once, not twice, many times, in your thoughts, in your patterns, in the same situations that keep coming back with different faces but the same outcome. And still, you push it aside, you delay the decision, you tell yourself it's not the right time, you distract your mind with other things, you convince yourself it will sort itself out, but it doesn't. And that is exactly why nothing is changing. This is not random, this is not bad luck. There is a system behind it, a pattern that most people never stop to understand, and it quietly shapes the direction of their entire life without them even realizing it. What looks like confusion is often clarity that feels uncomfortable. What feels like uncertainty is often a truth that demands action. And the longer it is ignored, the louder it becomes, not as guidance anymore, but as consequences. That's the part people rarely talk about. The shift from gentle signals to hard outcomes, from whispers to noise, from chances to regrets. And by the time it becomes obvious, the cost is already higher than it needed to be. This is where most people stay stuck, not because they lack intelligence, not because they don't want better, but because facing the truth requires a level of honesty that feels heavy in the moment. It forces a decision, it demands responsibility, it removes excuses, and the mind resists that. It chooses comfort over clarity, even when that comfort leads to long-term frustration. There is a hidden loop here that repeats itself in careers, relationships, habits, and even personal goals. The same patterns show up again and again until they are understood and acted on. This is why some people feel like they are moving but never progressing. They are busy but not aligned, active but not aware. And over time, that gap between what they know deep down and what they actually do starts to create pressure. That pressure turns into stress. That stress turns into burnout. And suddenly it feels like everything is going wrong at once, when in reality the signals were there from the beginning, just ignored. In this video, you are going to understand what these signals really are and why they keep appearing in your life. You will see how the mind tricks itself into avoiding what it already knows. You will learn the exact reason why repeating problems are not accidents but indicators pointing in one direction. And more importantly, you will learn what to do when the truth becomes clear but action feels difficult. This is not about motivation that fades after a few minutes. This is about seeing things in a way that makes it hard to go back to old patterns. A shift that stays. A perspective that follows you even after the video ends. There are also details that most people overlook. Small internal reactions and subtle external patterns that reveal more than they seem. Once you start noticing them, it changes how you respond to situations completely. That is where real control begins. Not by forcing outcomes, but by understanding what is already happening and responding to it correctly. Stay until the end because the final part brings everything together in a simple way that you can actually use without overthinking, without pressure, and without waiting for the perfect moment. Because the truth is, waiting is often the biggest trap. It feels safe, but it quietly steals time. And time is the one thing that does not come back once it moves forward. So if something inside feels slightly uncomfortable right now, that is not a bad sign. That is awareness starting to wake up. That is the moment where things can begin to shift if you allow it to. Welcome to the channel where we break down the patterns that control your life and turn them into something you can actually understand and use. If this kind of clarity is something you want more of, make sure you subscribe, because the next insight might be the one that changes everything for you. Days start to feel familiar in a way that is not comforting but heavy, like a pattern that keeps repeating even when you try to change small things around it. The same type of mistake shows up again wearing a slightly different face. The same kind of conversation leads to the same kind of ending. The same habits pull you back even after you promise yourself that this time will be different. And it slowly builds a quiet frustration that is hard to explain because from the outside everything may look normal, but inside there is a sense that something is not aligned, something is slightly off, and it keeps showing up in moments when you are alone or when things get quiet. That inner signal that tries to point something out, but instead of facing it directly, you move past it, you scroll, you distract your attention, you tell yourself you will think about it later, and later turns into another day, then another week, and nothing really changes, just the details around the same core issue shift a little, while the main pattern stays exactly where it was, and deep down there is already an understanding forming, not loud, not clear enough to force action, but strong enough to create discomfort, like a quiet truth sitting in the background. And even though it is there, it gets ignored because facing it would mean accepting something that might not feel easy. So the cycle continues, repeating mistakes without calling them mistakes, going through the same problems while hoping for a different outcome, and slowly building a gap between what you feel inside and what you choose to do on the outside. And that gap starts to create tension, a kind of pressure that is not always visible but is always present, influencing decisions in small ways. guiding reactions without being fully acknowledged. And over time, that pressure turns into a pattern that feels normal even though it was never meant to be. And in those moments where clarity almost shows itself, where the answer is right there for a second, it gets pushed away with a simple thought that now is not the right time. Or maybe it is not that serious. Or maybe things will adjust on their own. And this becomes the silent agreement you make with yourself, to delay instead of decide, to distract instead of understand, to hope instead of act. And it feels easier in the short term, but it slowly builds something heavier in the long term, because what is being avoided does not disappear. It stays, it grows, it repeats. And each time it comes back, it carries a little more weight than before. And this is where the shift begins to take shape, because what feels like random frustration is not random at all. It follows a pattern that is consistent and predictable. Even if it does not feel that way at first, life rarely starts by shouting. It starts quietly, with small signals that are easy to overlook. A slight feeling that something is not right, a moment of hesitation before making a decision, a sense that a certain direction does not feel aligned even if it looks correct from the outside. These are the early signals, subtle and easy to ignore, and most of the time they are ignored because they do not demand immediate attention. They allow you to continue without forcing a change, but when those signals are ignored again and again, they do not disappear. They start forming patterns, repeating situations that mirror the same underlying issue. Different people, different places, different circumstances, but the same core experience showing up again, and this is where it becomes more noticeable, but still avoidable. Because patterns can be explained away, they can be blamed on external factors, they can be justified with reasons that feel logical. And so the cycle continues, and as it continues, it moves into the next stage, where the consequences begin to show up. Not as gentle signals anymore, but as clear outcomes that are harder to ignore. Things that disrupt the flow, things that create visible discomfort, things that force attention even when it is not wanted. And by this point, it feels sudden, it feels unexpected. But it was building all along, step by step, signal by signal, pattern by pattern, until it reached a point where it could no longer stay quiet. And this is the part where many people feel confused, where they start asking why this is happening, why things keep going wrong, why the same kind of problems keep appearing. But what is often missed is that the clarity was already there much earlier, it just did not get accepted. And that is where the real shift in perspective happens, understanding that confusion is not always a lack of answers. Sometimes it is a resistance to the answer that is already present, a hesitation to accept what is known because accepting it would require change, and change comes with its own set of challenges. It disrupts comfort, it introduces uncertainty, it forces movement, and the mind naturally resists that. It prefers what is familiar even if it is not working. It holds on to patterns because they are known, even if they are limiting. And this is where avoidance takes shape, not as a conscious decision most of the time, but as a series of small choices that keep pushing the truth further away, staying in the comfort zone because it feels safe, even when it quietly creates dissatisfaction, avoiding change because it brings uncertainty, even when staying the same brings frustration, fearing loss, whether it is loss of stability, loss of identity, or loss of what has already been built, even if that thing is no longer serving its purpose. And these fears are not always obvious. They operate in subtle ways, shaping decisions without being clearly seen, making it easy to say that the situation is unclear or complicated, when in reality it is more about not wanting to face what is already understood. And this is where the simple but difficult realization comes in, that the issue is not confusion, it is avoidance, not because of weakness, but because of the natural tendency to protect comfort and avoid discomfort, even when that discomfort leads to growth. And accepting the truth changes everything because it removes the space for delay. It creates a point where a decision has to be made, where action becomes necessary, and that is the part that feels heavy, because action means responsibility. It means stepping into something uncertain. It means letting go of the idea that things will fix themselves without effort. And so the mind tries to stay in between, not fully ignoring the truth, but not fully accepting it either. Just enough awareness to feel the discomfort, but not enough commitment to create change. And that in-between state is where most of the frustration lives, where energy gets drained without clear progress, where time passes without meaningful movement, and where the same patterns continue to repeat under different names. And breaking out of that does not start with a big decision or a dramatic shift. It starts with recognizing what is already there, seeing the patterns for what they are, understanding that the repetition is not random, that the signals were not meaningless, that the discomfort is pointing somewhere specific, and that the clarity that feels uncomfortable is often the most important one, because it is the one that leads to change. And once that is seen clearly, the process begins to shift, slowly at first, then more steadily, as the gap between knowing and doing starts to close, and the patterns that once felt automatic begin to lose their hold, not because they were forced away, but because they were finally understood and addressed in a direct way, without delay, without distraction, without the need to pretend that everything is fine when it clearly is not. And that is where the real movement begins, not from external pressure, but from internal alignment. From a place where the truth is no longer avoided but used as a guide, even when it feels uncomfortable at the start. Because that discomfort is often the sign that something real is finally being faced instead of pushed aside again. There comes a point where the pattern is no longer quiet and no longer easy to explain away, a point where everything starts to feel heavier than it should, where time seems to move forward but nothing inside feels like it is actually progressing, and that is where the real cost begins to show itself in a way that cannot be ignored. Not as a sudden shock, but as a slow realization that something important has been slipping through your hands while you were waiting for the right moment, while you were hoping things would settle on their own, while you were choosing comfort over clarity again and again. And the weight of that shows up in different ways. Sometimes as a feeling of being stuck even when you are busy all day, sometimes as a quiet frustration that does not have a clear reason but is always present in the background, sometimes as a sense that you are capable of more but unable to move toward it. And that is where time becomes the first visible loss, not in big dramatic chunks but in small unnoticed pieces, days turning into weeks, weeks turning into months, all carrying the same unresolved issue forward, all repeating the same cycle with slight variations, and it feels like movement because things are happening, but in reality it is motion without direction, effort without alignment, and that is where the real loss hides. Not in what you failed to do, but in what you kept delaying even when you already knew it mattered. And alongside time there is energy slowly draining in ways that are hard to measure but easy to feel, because holding on to something that is not aligned requires constant effort. It creates internal resistance, it pulls attention away from what actually matters, it fills your mind with unfinished thoughts and quiet tension. And over time that turns into exhaustion that rest alone cannot fix, because it is not coming from physical effort. It is coming from misalignment, from carrying something that should have been addressed earlier but was pushed forward instead. And as that energy gets drained, opportunities start to pass by, not always in obvious ways. Sometimes they are small openings that you are not ready to take because your focus is somewhere else. Sometimes they are chances that require clarity and quick action, but you are still in a state of hesitation. And sometimes they are paths that never even appear because the current pattern blocks them before they can show up. And this is where the cost becomes deeper. Because it is not only about what you lost, it is also about what you never allowed to exist in the first place. And that is when the realization starts to hit harder, that ignoring the truth does not keep things the same. It quietly makes them heavier, more complicated, more difficult to change later, because every delay adds another layer, every avoidance adds more weight, and the pain that could have been small and manageable at the beginning grows into something that feels overwhelming simply because it was left unattended for too long. And that is the turning point, not a dramatic moment, but a clear shift where it becomes impossible to keep pretending that nothing is wrong, where the cost of staying the same becomes higher than the discomfort of changing. And that is where something different has to happen, not perfectly, not all at once, but honestly and directly, starting with a simple pause, not to escape, not to distract, but to actually face what has been sitting in the background this whole time, to bring it into focus without trying to soften it or reshape it into something easier, just to see it as it is, and to ask a question that cuts through all the noise: what truth have I been avoiding? And to sit with that question without rushing to answer it in a way that feels safe, to allow the real answer to come forward even if it feels uncomfortable, because that discomfort is often the sign that you are getting closer to something real. And once that truth becomes clear, the next step is not to argue with it, not to find reasons why it might not be fully accurate, not to delay it with more thinking, but to stop negotiating with reality, to accept it as it is without adding conditions, without waiting for a better time, without looking for a version of it that feels easier, because reality does not change based on how comfortable it feels. It only becomes heavier when it is resisted. And acceptance does not mean giving up. It means seeing clearly. It means removing the layer of denial that keeps things stuck. And from that place, the next step becomes possible, taking one small action that aligns with that truth. Not something perfect, not something that fixes everything at once, just one honest step in the right direction, something real, something that moves you even slightly out of the old pattern. Because movement matters more than perfection at this stage, and that small action starts to create a shift, a break in the cycle that has been repeating for so long. And it may not feel big at first, it may even feel insignificant, but it changes the direction, and direction is what shapes outcomes over time. And once that step is taken, it is not about stopping there, it is about repeating the process, coming back to that same level of honesty again and again, continuing to face what is real, continuing to accept it without resistance, continuing to act in small but consistent ways that align with it. And over time, this builds something stronger than motivation. It builds alignment, a state where what you know and what you do start to match more closely, where the gap between awareness and action begins to close, and as that gap closes, the patterns that once felt automatic start to weaken, because they no longer have the same space to operate, and this is where the perspective begins to shift in a deeper way, where the truth is no longer seen as something heavy or threatening, but as something useful, something that simplifies instead of complicates, because it removes confusion, it removes unnecessary thinking, it points directly to what matters. And in that sense, it becomes clear that the truth was never the problem, the resistance to it was, and once that resistance is reduced, everything becomes more direct, more focused, more manageable, and the truth starts to feel less like an enemy and more like a shortcut, a way to move forward without wasting time on things that do not align, a way to avoid repeating the same cycles over and over again. And this shift changes how you respond to discomfort as well, because it is no longer seen as something to avoid at all costs, but as a signal that something important is being revealed, something that has the potential to move you forward if it is faced directly instead of ignored. And in that sense, the truth is not there to hurt you, it is there to wake you up, to bring attention to what needs to change before it grows into something harder to handle, to guide you in a way that is simple but not always easy. And the more this is understood, the less power the old patterns have, because they rely on avoidance to survive. And once avoidance is replaced with awareness and action, even in small steps, the entire direction begins to shift in a way that feels more controlled, more intentional, and more real. Not because everything is perfect, but because it is finally aligned with what is true instead of what is comfortable. Maybe the signs were never unclear. Maybe they were always right there, repeating in different ways, showing up again and again, waiting for the moment you would finally stop and pay attention. And maybe the real reason nothing changed was not because you didn't try, not because you didn't care, but because you weren't ready to listen yet. Not fully, not honestly. But now something feels different. Now you can see it a little more clearly. Now that quiet voice is harder to ignore. And that matters more than anything. Because change never starts with perfect timing. It starts with awareness. It starts with a moment like this, where things begin to make sense in a way they didn't before. And from here, everything can shift. Not all at once, not overnight, but step by step, decision by decision, as long as you stay real with yourself and stop turning away from what you already know. So if something in this video made you pause even for a second, if something clicked in a way you didn't expect, don't let that moment pass like all the others. Stay connected, be part of this journey, because these small moments of clarity are rare and they can change everything if you hold on to them and act on them. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Like this video so more people can find it. And share it with someone who might need to hear this right now but hasn't realized it yet. Because sometimes the message reaches you exactly when it's meant to. And sometimes the truth you keep avoiding is not there to hold you back, it's there to move you forward. It's there to bring you closer to the life that actually fits who you are. Because sometimes the truth you avoid is the life you're meant to live.